A warm welcome back to everybody for session 2 of this year's 2021 ISNTD D3. We had a fantastic session to start the day off, rethinking financial incentives for drugs and diagnostics for NTDs. And it is very, very apparent that the role of the PDP moving forward in terms of that access, that bridge between the access requirements of the patient groups themselves into, let's say, the R&D processes, as it were, is going to be a vital step as we move forward. And for us, the whole kind of the central thrust for the for D3 for this year was really going to be all about access. We alluded to some of this in the previous session, where the seminal 2017 award by the US FDA of their priority review voucher for the DNDi's pediatric benznidazole program, the treatment for Chagas disease, was really a seminal moment in which access really came into its own. They won the award by putting down a firm commitment, a marker that 50% of that multi-million-dollar award would end up in access programs on the ground in terms of access to this drug for those communities. A very strong commitment, and they were given that award. Subsequent awards have followed that type of pattern. We thought we'd really put access at the center of future drug development, and this is why this particular panel, we've kind of formed this panel. But I thought we'd start off by looking really at one of the kind of leading lights in terms of shining a light onto access at the corporate level. There's a biannual index. I'm sure many of the viewers here are familiar with the Access to Medicines Foundation index that comes out every 2 years. We thought that'd be a great place to start this session. So a warm welcome to Margo Warren from the Government and Engagement Policy Unit at the ATM Foundation.
Thanks very much. Thank you for having me on this panel. I think it's such an important topic, and thank you to the others on this panel as well. I look forward to hearing from you all. I'll share my screen as I go through some slides, and then we can probably take some questions at the end. So I'm going to be talking today about the involvement and necessary required action from the pharmaceutical industry. Just as a reminder, we are a research foundation. We are completely independent from the pharma industry. We don't receive any funding from them. And our goal is to guide and stimulate pharmaceutical companies to do more for people living in low and middle income countries with respect to access to medicine and limiting drug-resistant infections. And we're funded by the UK government, the Dutch government, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome, and AXA Investment Managers. So just a little overview of what we measure to sort of set the stage. The 2021 index was launched this past January, and we look at 3 main technical areas. The first is governance of access, so what's happening within the companies themselves, is the leadership participating in access goals, that type of thing. Then we do R&D, and we do product delivery. And I would encourage you to check out our website and to take a look at the index itself. There are company report cards and best practices as well. So we do look at the 20 largest pharmaceutical companies in the R&D space. 106 low and middle income countries are in our scope, and 82 disease conditions and pathogens, including 20 neglected tropical diseases. And our product type scope is actually quite broad as well. So it's not just medicine, but also vaccines, vector control products, diagnostics, and a few others. So I'd like to share some overall findings and to unpack kind of some progress over the past decade where we've seen movement and how it relates to some of our findings from the 2021 index. So as I mentioned, we have 20 companies in scope across all of their portfolios. There are over 1,000 projects in the pipeline across all of those 82 diseases, conditions, and pathogens. But what we're seeing is that there has been some progress over the past 10 years. So in 2019, we did a longitudinal analysis on what the company response to access has been over the past decade. This year, we're able to add a couple more years to that analysis. But we saw originally there were less than 40 projects in scope in 2014 for NTDs. And today there are nearly 90. So that's quite a good level of progress. but we still need to see more. There are 15 companies involved. We'd like, of course, for all 20 companies to be involved where applicable. But what's important to note as well is that it's still quite low in comparison to other disease areas. So I'll move on to access planning. So what we look at in the Access to Medicine Index as well in the R&D space is whether companies are planning ahead for access while projects are still in the pipeline. And this is important, as I mentioned in the previous session, because it means that as soon as a project is approved and on the market, it's really being deployed in the countries that need it the most. If there's a specific access plan attached that is strong, and that really does factor in things like where a product will be registered, if it will be made affordable at a cool pricing point, if supply considerations will be factored in. So there's a lot that goes into these plans, and they're really important. When we look at all of the late stage R&D projects in scope of the index, so that's close to 400, we see that almost 40% do have access plans in place. Now that needs to be much higher. It really should be, all of these important late stage projects that do have access plans attached. But when we unpack it and we look at the NTD space specifically, that's where we see out of those almost 400 late stage R&D projects, there are actually 17 that do pertain to neglected tropical diseases. And of those, we see 15 actually do have access plans. So that's actually quite a significant percentage, upwards of 90% in comparison to this 40% overall. So it's promising to see, but it also means that there are still cases where companies are developing products. There's projects in the pipeline that do pertain to neglected tropical diseases that don't have an access plan attached. And that really, is an important point to make, because it should be 100%. What we're also seeing in general in access planning amongst the companies that we incentivize and evaluate are bigger commitments to look at access planning overall. So this is promising. We had one company, as Cameron pointed out in his initial remarks, previously it was Novartis who was sort of planning more strategically across their portfolio, but now this year we actually have 8 who have committed to systematically plan for access. So this is also, again, promising to see. We want to make sure that companies are held accountable for these wonderful commitments, but that they do actually follow through and make sure that their plans translate into access strategies in the countries that need them the most, and specifically for neglected tropical diseases in this case. So we also look in the context of the index at donation programs. This is important because we want to make sure that companies remain engaged and committed to ensuring access to their donated products, especially where NTD elimination, eradication, and control programs are possible. So this means that we consider the scale, the geographic scope, and the timeline, and the patient reach of these donation programs. So what we're finding is that this number has gone up over the past decade and over a decade. This is good to see. Again, I think it's in response to the London Declaration and to new PDPs over the past 10 years that have come into play, and I'll unpack that in a couple of slides later on. But we do want to see a continuation of these commitments. So unfortunately, the Kigali Summit was postponed due to COVID, but it doesn't mean that companies can't make those new commitments. And we have seen some best practice from 5 companies, GSK, ASI, MSD, Merck, and Sanofi, who have made those recommitments publicly to some of the donation programs that exist for NTDs, and expanded their donations to include more patient populations beyond WHO's set patient milestone. So we'd like to see that from all companies in scope that do have those programs. So just a couple of lessons learned. Over the past 10 years, we have seen a very clear formula develop that has encouraged more companies to participate. As I said, the number of companies that are involved in R&D in the NTD space has grown, and I think this is because of some of these great initiatives like the 2012 London Declaration provides a platform for this public commitment and engagement, and enables companies to share their progress, and that really encouraged a lot of companies to participate in the space. We also find that publicly funded de-risking and market achievement mechanisms can be quite helpful. As well, PDPs have been incredibly successful, as I mentioned in my previous remarks for the first session, but we need, again, more companies to come to the table and participate, and make sure that they're, sharing important IP and really contributing to those PDPs as well, because we have seen them be quite successful. And just long-term coordinated financial support from multiple donors and from national governments as well, who are, committed to this and who prioritize it. And I think some of the changes in the roadmap that we'll probably discuss later on would point to some of those areas as well. So the road ahead in the coming decade, as I said, we did a lot of analysis on the past decade, but it's important to look forward as well, and to recognize that there has been progress made, but we also need some scale up, and we need to make sure that it's sustainable. The new NTD roadmap, I think, will be really instrumental in encouraging companies to renew some of their commitments. In the past, we've seen that the company commitments have sometimes been a bit scattered in terms of their renewal for the London Declaration commitment. So we want to see, again, just more companies renew these commitments, make sure that they're on board, especially when it's a goal towards eradication, elimination, control. The impact can be so great if they continue to participate. And just making sure that we're all kind of working towards the same goals, and we're all quite clear about what those goals are, and that can be really instrumental for moving companies and for this formula that I mentioned before, that when companies understand what the expectations are, they're more likely to make changes and to meet the expectations of the global health community.
Thank you very much, Margo, for that wonderful presentation. The reason we wanted you guys there is you really have kind of led the charge in terms of pushing access into the corporate mindset with your index, and it really has shown how access is creeping along from this almost afterthought position to a far more centralized position in terms of the R&D activities of the corporate world per se. So we thought we'd have that presentation first. So thank you very much for that, Margo. We've been joined in the interim by various countries, actually. So quick shout out. So from Italy, Professor Maria Paola Costi, from the National Institute of Health in Porto, Portugal, from Dr. Maria João Govia, from Nigeria, Dr. John Jodede Oluwasejan, from the Netherlands, Natasha Bardawaj, who will be speaking later on the digital diagnostics sessions, I think, tomorrow. From Makerere University in Uganda, Solomon Wafuala, another Ben Lukubei from Uganda, from the Kemri Wellcome Trust in Kenya, from the DRC, Celestine Mudogo from the University of Kinshasa. We've got a lot of people here from across the African continent. We've got Dr. Fred Santos from Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil. So a big shout out to everybody. We've got Sergey coming in from Russia, who's telling us, Sergey Kozlov, that it's already 10:30 there. So a big shout out to everybody there, and a great first presentation. We thought we'd move from that kind of macro look at the way access is moving into the corporate mindset, and get more of a kind of drill down and move to the kind of next speaker in this, and that would be from the GHIT fund. We've had Hayato Urabe speaking from their investment strategy perspective, and now we'd like to welcome Dr. Isaac Chikwanha, the Senior Director really for the access and delivery programs at the GHIT fund, based actually in Geneva, so it's not that late in the evening for you there, Isaac. I'd like to just to call you to the floor.
Thanks very much, Kamran. As Kamran has already introduced me, I'm from the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund. So just to give you a bit of a background to GHIT. So GHIT is an international public-private partnership that was launched in 2013, and it brings together the Japanese government, two foundations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, UNDP, and industry. So it is really unique in that sense that it really brings this different set of stakeholders together to fund research and development for tuberculosis, neglected tropical diseases, and malaria health technologies. By health technology, I mean vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. And the trust really, so if you look at the picture, you see that little picture there. So like most of the the big tech companies, we hear of how they were started in the in garages and stuff like that. So GHIT was actually the concept of GHIT was started over a meal in Tokyo. You can see a bowl of ramen there. And really, the discussion was centered around the access to medicines index, where there was a realization that there wasn't a lot of Japanese companies that were on top of that list in terms of access to medicines. So that's when the idea started. So the idea was really to leverage Japanese innovation, technology, and academia for global health. That's how GHIT started. So these are the funding partners for GHIT, as I've already mentioned. The full partners. So and we the way it's set up. So we have a sort of unique funding system, a matching funding system, where we start with industry partners, and whatever they put on the table. The philanthropic partners, we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. They match that, and then that sort of brings that to the private component of GHIT funding, which is 50%, and then that is matched by the Japanese government and UNDP. So that's how the partnership is set up. In terms of the product development partners, so if, even though GHIT pushes the GHIT tries to push Japanese technology and innovations, we do work with international organization. It is actually a requirement for GHIT funding that a Japanese it should be a partnership between a Japanese entity and an international entity. So you can see that's just a representation of some of the organizations we work with across the globe. Currently, we have 9 Japanese organizations and 52 Japanese organizations. So that means some of them have multiple relationships, and we have multiple products that we're pushing for some of the partnerships. And up to date since 2013, that's just shows the investments we have had so far. So we focus on the 3 diseases, and that's the breakdown we see on the diseases. And the breakdowns you see here in terms of the interventions of the disease are not necessarily by choice. We don't necessarily choose to have 47% NTDs or 67% drugs, or 57% preclinical activities. This just depends on the responses we get to the request for proposals that we sent out. Although we do look at we do prioritize certain interventions, particularly NTDs, but really that shows the kind of proposals we get from potential grantees. And up to date, we have used invested more than 230 million, almost 230 million US dollars across 97 projects, and 53 of them are active to date. And we fund different phases of development from discovery all the way to clinical phases of development. So that's just, I know this slide is a little bit busy. So you can find more details of this on the GHIT website, but it just gives you a snap preview of the GHIT portfolio at the moment. So, but you can find more details of this on the website, so I will not go into the details of this. And just to zoom in on the neglected tropical diseases and on the leading clinical candidates that we hopefully hope to see being launched in the next couple of years. So that's what we have. We have pediatric praziquantel, which where GHIT is funding together with the EDCTP, and this is being developed by the Pediatric Praziquantel Consortium. And then we also have a drug for the treatment of eumycetoma, which is GHIT is funding, and this is being developed by DNDi, using a product from ASI. So that's just a quick snapshot of what we have in terms of the late stage products for NTDs. And as you can see, this is still a very, very empty pipeline as far as NTDs are concerned. We are looking at 20 NTDs, and this is all we have in the late stages, but we do have quite a few other products in early stages of development. So we've been talking about what GHIT does in terms of research and development. So what exactly do we do in Access? At GHIT, we do acknowledge that there's not, and I think this is everybody agrees that not enough is being done in terms of research and development or in terms of access and delivery for neglected tropical diseases. But we also acknowledge that the fact that no one is doing anything doesn't mean somebody should do everything. That's why GHIT chose to really focus on the research and development component. And our access and delivery strategy is really, we use the acronym LINK, where we basically leverage research and developing funding to have early access considerations, and we influence launch strategies from our grantees and companies that we fund. And we also engage in networking to catalyze the strategic partnerships for access. I'll explain a little bit later how that works. So if you look at this, what we like to call the access value chain, which really shows how a product goes from innovation all the way to last mile delivery. We could roughly divide it into two components, as my colleague previously mentioned in the other session. That is two sides of the same coin. So if you look on the blue side, it's mostly the research and development, and then the gray side is more the classic access. And GHIT has been focusing mostly on the blue side, but we do acknowledge that we have a vested interest in making sure that the products that we fund have a smooth pathway to all the way to last mile delivery to actually have the impact that we want. So how do we engage in the actual access? And again, just starting by looking at this pathway, and then for those who are involved in access, we have what we call the access principles, and one of the access principles is availability. So just by investing in research and development, we have already started the path, the access path. So for GHIT, we consider that just by investing in the research and development, we are already trying to make products available. So that's already the first step towards access. And we call this a bottom-up approach, where we actually work with industry partners, innovators, academics. And the first thing, one of the things that we're doing really, which is linked to what the Access to Medicine Index is really tracking, is more like a practical application of really those concepts that the Access to Medicine Index is tracking, really to make sure that companies and grantees have early consideration of access during R&D. By this, we always start with the TPP, or what is exactly needed, and then the product. The research and development should be geared towards answering that question. But of course, at that point, we also encourage companies and grantees or innovators to really start looking at how that drug is going to be regulated. Is it going to be to go via the stringent regulatory authorities? Is it going to go through the WHO PQ system? Is it going to be registered in country? What are the processes that are required? How is this drug or how is this product going to be manufactured? Where is it going to be manufactured? It might be too early to actually have a price, depending on how far you're along the research and development pathway. It might be too early to have an actual price of a product, but already you should start considering the price, the cost of the products in relation to who's going to use it. And we fund products for mostly low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, and low-resource settings. So price is always a factor. So at that point, that early in R&D, we work very closely with the innovators and the product developers to make sure that all these access considerations are already in there, so that even though we don't really invest in access itself, by the time the product actually goes to that phase of the access value chain, all these things are already in place, and you don't start running around thinking about cold chain at that point. You don't start running around thinking about procurement at that point, but all these things are already sort of taken care of. So we work particularly for the late stage products. We have what we call launch strategies. This is where we basically ask the grantees or the applicants to have to present a launch strategy, a launch plan of how they see their product getting to the market, going all the way to last mile delivery. And then throughout the R&D, we work very closely with the companies and the innovators and the product developers to make sure that, you know, issues of regulatory requirements, manufacturing, procurement, supply, volume needs estimates are all considered all the way until we normally stop once a product is regulated, but throughout all the processes before that and after that, we work very closely with the companies throughout the process. And then obviously by funding R&D, GHIT provides some kind of delinkage to the eventual cost of the products, enhancing affordability. So this is what we call the bottom-up approach of how GHIT invests in access, even though, I mean, it's not like financial investments in access itself, like we don't actually procure, but we ensure that by the time the procurement product is at procurement stage, it is affordable and it is easy to procure. And then on a more global stage, we have a top-down approach where we work with, where we try to really bring together multi-sectoral stakeholders. And one good example is what has already been said in the previous session, which is the Uniting Efforts for Innovation, Access and Delivery, which is a platform by the Japanese government, UNDP, ADP, Access and Development Partnership, and GHIT, where we bring in innovators, funders, access stakeholders, policymakers, really to discuss the different issues that have an impact on access to delivery of NTD technologies, be the regulatory issues. And then we discuss issues like, for example, something that's really gaining momentum now, like the consolidation of regulatory practices across the African continent, for example. That could really go a long way in facilitating access. So we discuss all these different issues and we propose solutions. So like in the last year, we actually published 2 documents, knowledge products, one on investment cases and one on funding innovative financing for access and delivery. So these are some of the kind of the tools that we produce from this global approach. And of course, one of the things that we push for through this global approach is the formation of strategic partnerships for access and delivery, because we do understand that this is something that we're probably not a specialist of, but we need to be part of. And we also understand really the strength of working together, the different stakeholders coming together. So that we call the strategic partnerships for access and delivery. So in a nutshell, this is really how GHIT gets engaged in access and delivery. I don't think I have another slide on that, Kamran, and I would stop here at this moment and then I can entertain any questions.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that, Isaac. I thought it was a very interesting overview and a real kind of emphasis from GHIT Fund in terms of addressing access and delivery through forming those critical strategic partnerships. You mentioned one of these, the Uniting Healthcare Partnership with the government of Japan. I'm sure we'll come to that in the Q&A, but let's start to say thank you very, very much for that. I think it's very complimentary. You used this expression that the two sides of a coin, with Hayato Urabe talking about the investment side of that coin and yourself speaking about the the access side of that coin. So I thank you very, very much for that. Some great comments coming through from the chat as well. I think a round of applause there. I think we're going to move to the next speakers. As I understand it, the next speakers don't have a presentation to give per se. So what I thought I'd do, the next speaker should be Mathias, who's the chair of the ILEP panel of persons affected by leprosy. It's an umbrella organization, ILEP, looking at all of the various efforts from community level all the way through to R&D for leprosy. In your opinion, what is access to? You've heard access from the kind of corporate movement level, company level, from the ATM Foundation. And I wanted to hear from you, what does it mean from your perspective, from your perspective as the chair of the ILEP persons affected by leprosy? Could you give us your definition of access?
My definition of access is, I think in the end it goes to, like, let's go ask that person affected by leprosy or by any other NTD that is living in that remote village, wherever that is, in Congo, in India, or in Papua New Guinea, and let's hear from them if they have access, if they really get, but not just if they get the drugs, if it's really making a difference for them, yeah. And that has to do also with living conditions and other things that we might not even think about that they tell us there, yeah.
Okay, so basically getting the voice from the communities themselves and having a mechanism in place by which that voice can translate into their actual access needs. I mean, I think that's a very admirable way of looking at it. And I think that's a very good place to, if I'm honest with you, to bring in the other panelists. We can go straight to the Q&A. I think there's enough there to move into the Q&A, if that's okay. So if I could ask the other panelists, Margo, Olawale again for the second session. So thank you for the first session, Olawale, as well. On that definition of access in terms of Mathias's patient-centric, giving them a voice, if you align that to the first shift that we want to discuss in terms of the shift in the WHO NTD roadmap to 2030, and the various impacts to access as a concept that will entail, I wanted to kind of pick up on that. One of the first shifts, well, the first shift that we wanted to look at is really this move from an action-based measure of success of a program or intervention, therapeutic, into a more impact-driven, and that's at the community level, impact-driven measure of success. That's one of the first shifts in the WHO roadmap. And what I wanted to ask the panel is that coupled with what Mathias has just said about his definition of access, i.e. the patient's voice, my question is, what kind of mechanisms let's start with drug companies to start with, and I'll ask this to Margo first. What kind of mechanisms have you seen drug companies putting into play in terms of addressing that particular access gap, giving a voice to the people? So Margo, to you, from your work at the ATM Foundation, what have you seen as concrete steps in terms of mechanisms?
Yeah, I would say that definitely there has been a shift towards more of an emphasis on measuring as well in many different areas, particularly in pricing and capacity building. We've seen that people do want to know more about what the actual impact on the ground is, and we've embedded that within our methodology, but there's other initiatives as well that focus more on the actual impact of these strategies and what that means on the ground in terms of increasing the number of patients that do have access to some of these therapies and vaccines and diagnostics. So I think that it's a positive trend, but I certainly agree with the sentiment that there needs to be more of it. There needs to be more proof that this is happening, and more attention paid to what actually is the impact of this particular program. Is it working? Is it beneficial? And if it's not, and being transparent and honest about what the failures have been and why, and allowing all companies to learn from things that have gone wrong so that there can be improvement in the future.
Okay, so thank you for that. I think your sound is coming in and out a little bit, Margo. It might be a sound connection issue there, but thank you very much for those points. Yeah, there's some issue on the sound on your side, apparently, but I got most of that in terms of what you were saying there. So thank you for that. From the perspective of a PDP, heavily involved in delivering access, putting those commitments down to get those awards, such as the ones we've mentioned in terms of the seminal award on pediatric Chagas. Olawale, I'd like to ask you, how would you envisage the shaping of those mechanisms that translate from the patient, the affected group, their access needs to the corporate setting or to a stakeholder setting?
It's a good question. It's a difficult one to answer, though, I have to be honest. But you know, for us, so PDP, DNDi, everything starts with having a decent plan in place and a holistic plan that captures all the facets of market access, right? So if you think of that entire value chain up to scale up, because I mean, many access plans stop around market entry and you don't think about scale up. But you think about the entire value chain up to scale up. It's very important that you have this iterative access plan where you basically consider everything. And not just your activities as an organization, but also like what other partners should be doing, because that helps you essentially identify the gaps, and that serves as a fundraising opportunity if no one is filling those gaps. But then the benefit of having this holistic access plan that you keep updating as you go is that it basically also enables you to, it sets a roadmap for how you engage with even the companies, right? Because what you essentially do is that you have clear roles and responsibilities from the very beginning, that if company X, we're going to bring this product to market, this is our co-created access plan, not just for DNDi, but also the company, and you articulate exactly what the responsibilities of the companies are, and you essentially track the access plans together. We found that has been incredibly helpful for us, because again, it just creates this ownership from the very beginning, this sense of, you know, joint implementation. And then where there are gaps, it's easy to identify, and then you can go and lobby and, you know, advocate and so on.
So singing from the same hymn sheet, the same mindset is a very important factor in that. And that's a very good answer, actually, Olawale. I appreciate that, especially from the mouth of the PDP, Head of Access for one of the most successful product development programs in NTDs today. So that's a very important point you've made there. Just nipping back to something that Margo said a second ago in terms of better measures of impact, being part of this, in terms of bringing the voice of the people back, in terms of having a better, more robust measurement of impact. I'd like to push that back to Mathias for a second, because in a realistic setting, from within the patient groups you deal with for leprosy, those measures of impact, do you think you have to incorporate into those measures the comorbidity, the kind of, as an example, leprosy, you have lymphatic filariasis can occur with leprosy, or you have different overlaps when it comes to stigmas, that type of things, those type of things impacting the access measure. How do you think they're going to play out when it comes to trying to translate their actual access needs back as a measure? How important is that going to be to you, Mathias?
Well, I think everything plays a very important role, even like things like the whole socioeconomic thing, gender. I remember in 2010 when I had the first signs of leprosy, and I was lucky and very fortunate and privilege to be at the right place at the right time. I met some people that it took them 6 months to get treatment, and a man my same age, and he had his hand impaired. And I was so getting the drugs to people at the right time is very important. But maybe some diseases are different with that. But like we have right now, we have people in Brazil who have been waiting for their treatment for months. Because pandemic, because regulations, because logistics, they don't even know where exactly the problem is. But we were experiencing that issue. Then also with leprosy and perhaps with other NTDs, we have an issue that people get leprosy reactions, and we need more research and development for that too, because sometimes you don't know what is worse, the reactions or the treatment, because most of them are treated with steroids, yeah, with all of that, what it brings with it. And then you, like, for example, when I took the treatment for 6 months, I felt weak and tired. And imagine someone who does not have those living conditions that I had, who has poor nutrition, not adequate housing, no access to clean water, what it will do to them. Will they be able to work? And then take into account stigma. Yeah, stigma prevents people from coming forward. Take into account gender issues. Yeah, usually we see sometimes that in many NTDs, women are the last ones to come forward because they feel responsible for that. Everyone in their house takes the first place, and all of these things play into this. That's why it is very important that not that we hear once from persons affected, and not that we hear from me, but that we constantly go back and see, is this really working? Is this really improving there? You know? Yeah.
So developing those measures, as Margo is alluding to as well. I'd like to ask you that question, Isaac, from a strategic partnerships perspective. You seem to have encapsulated your work in access and delivery at the GHIT Fund in making the right type of partnerships, the right type of partners. How would you cover the issues that Mathias has just breached there in terms of the type of partnerships moving forward? Would you look to cover those issues in those partnerships? And if so, how?
I think really, maybe just to start by saying, it's really about, if you saw the title of at the beginning of my presentation, it was research and development for impact. Really, it's I mean, we as a funder, we're not going to be judged by how many products we have on shelves. We're going to be judged by how many products are actually having an impact on the ground. So just to give you a practical example of how some of the strategic partnerships, one of the strategic partnerships we're working with one of the, our grantees, the Pediatric Praziquantel Consortium. Sorry, I keep going to this because it's something that's more tangible and it's really close to the ground. So one of the things that we're doing now is the product is getting closer to the market, is the consortium has gone back to ground, so to speak, and really now talking to the stakeholders on the ground, the national programs, the clinicians, the nurses on the ground. We know, Praziquantel is not new. We know how to use it in children of school-going age. Particularly for mass drug administration programs, because you go to schools and you get these children gathered there. But this is a product for preschool age children, and we don't really know how it's going to be used, because in most of Africa we don't really have formal preschool, so you don't really get gathering of preschool children. So we need to have systems and mechanisms to ensure that those children have the same access, as school-age children. So for that, we need to already start working on some kind of maybe country level, local level partnerships on the ground.
Yeah.
Maybe be it a community center of sorts. That's already a partnership that we can already start. Those are partnerships that we can already start developing with those community level, groupings to really ensure that once the product is available, it can go to those children through those. I mean, if we're looking at mass drug distribution, for example, mass drug administration, then that community gathering could be, an entry point. But for that, we need to already start building those community, blocks. And that's already a kind of strategic partnership where you're linking the community, the national program, to the corporate, to the people who are developing the drug, which is the corporate sector, and to us, the funders as GHIT. We are funding this, so we're already involved.
Yeah.
Even though we're not going to be there, on the last day. So that's just one example of a strategic partnership, really grassroots-based partnership that can be developed.
So
but there are different partnerships that you can look at. Yeah,
that's a fantastic answer, actually, Isaac, and exactly what we want to hear and what we need to hear. I guess the more involvement of the patient groups, the civic society. You use the word grassroots, informing the processes above that. So it's a fantastic answer. We've had a question come in from Johnson & Johnson, the pharma company. Dr. Francis Bergwood Ovawi is asking specifically, what can industry do to effectively respond to the need to expand access to current and new therapies for leprosy? I'll ask that firstly to Mathias, because obviously you're involved directly in the leprosy field, and then I'll widen that to the rest of the panel. So what can industry do? Mathias.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that I have the the technical expertise to respond that, but I think, we need more research and development, both for the current MDT, the multi-drug therapy. It's good. I think it could be better. And people think that, yeah. And then also for the treatment of reactions of leprosy reactions that can be very hard on people and can be devastating in terms of producing impairments. Yeah.
Okay, so more for the so thank you for those answers. Margo, to you, in terms of expanding access to current and new therapies for leprosy, have you come across this in any specific way in your index work?
Yeah, thank you. And leprosy is in the scope of our work, and it is something that we look at in the R&D space as well, and we look at the projects that are in the pipeline. There are 2 for medicines. However, there are still gaps that do need to be filled in other areas. So I think what we always advocate for, and we measure within the index and incentivize within the index, is to participate in more R&D projects, of course, specifically in this case for leprosy, but also to make sure that products that are on the market are made widely available, if there's equitable pricing strategies attached to them or donations attached to them. So it is, I think, echoing some of the sentiments earlier, that it's that whole value chain. So not just from R&D, but also all the way down to last mile delivery that we would look at and incentivize within the context of the index. And now, again, with this conversation about, making sure that we're thinking about how to measure actual impact on the ground.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a very good answer. Thank you for that, Margo. And I think that brings us to the next question, or the next shift in the WHO roadmap, and that's moving from a disease-specific vertical approach to a more horizontal, cross-cutting approach. And so I suppose I wanted to ask that question in light of that. We mentioned earlier, Mathias, so access barriers for these leprosy patients, if you just focus on leprosy for a second and then widen it, those access barriers in part may be linked to in some way linked to their kind of having more than just one disease, so leprosy with lymphatic filariasis. What kind of touch points in different disease settings could we bring access into in terms of enhance access? What kind of partnerships, or what kind of lessons to be learned from outside of leprosy for those patients? Mathias.
Well, I think there's much to be done, and when I've been in some working groups and in some places where we have talked about, there's commonalities, there's things that we can learn from each other, and certainly there are things that we need to think about. For example, if a person needs to get treatment for one NTD in this place, and then it's a completely different process and maybe a complicated process to get treatment for the other NTD. I mean, we need to integrate things more so that it's not that complicated and time-consuming for people. But then also, like, we need to see how we can work together. And there, within the ILEP partners, which is a federation of NGOs that work with leprosy, there are organizations that have sponsored, that have facilitated self-care groups, self-help groups for people who are like affected by leprosy, lymphatic filariasis, and other NTDs, and they encourage each other, they support each other, and they help each other. So I think there's still a lot that we can learn, and that we can enrich each other in this process. Yeah.
So thank you for that, Mathias. And I suppose I was to ask the same question to Olawale as head of access. Are the DNDi actively looking at pulling expertise, as it were, or best practice from different diseases that are applicable in an access setting? What are your views on that?
We certainly are, and I would encourage everyone to, after this meeting, go on our website and look at our new policy on access, where we clearly articulate, the direction where we want to go as an organization, and integration is captured there. What do I think? So integration on paper is it's easy for us to have this conversation about integration, right? But it's incredibly complex, and it's not just complex because global partners don't want to integrate, but even the health systems themselves, the way they are set up, sometimes it's not completely integrated, right? You still have several silos. So the way HIV care is provided, for example, in many countries, is still very much vertical, TB programs and so on. So you're dealing with a really complex issue, and the way that, at least in my head, I try to articulate this is to look for low-hanging fruits, like entry points. What are those like small entry points where we can begin to integrate NTD services and other services, right? One area that we see is diagnostics, right? Your diagnostic platform it does a lot of things, right? And so, just by using that diagnostic entry point, it's possible to begin to think beyond just a certain disease, right? When you think about how you place your diagnostics within the health system, again, it forces you to start to think beyond the disease. If we use the example of COVID at the moment, thousands of devices are being, PCR devices are being placed in Africa. And of course, these devices are making in centers where COVID are getting like high volumes from. But one day COVID will be over. The question is, how do we take that COVID, infrastructure, diagnostic infrastructure, design it in a way where it serves, other disease areas? But that is, it's a low-hanging fruit. So I would say, diagnostics is clearly one area. The second area is capacity building, right? Many of the healthcare workers that we are trying to reach and build their capacity, they do like a plethora of things. They're not just doing NTDs, they're doing a bunch of things. And these people are being reached by other like vertical disease areas, and they're offered trainings. I think we need to start to think creatively about how we, just maybe even starting with NTDs, right? How with all the funding that is going towards capacity building in NTDs, how do we begin to harmonize? And then how do we go beyond?
Yeah. That's a very, very good point. Some very interesting points Olawale raised there. You mentioned diagnostics. I suppose I wanted to ask this to Isaac, that given all of the comments made by Margo, Olawale and Mathias in terms of this particular question, how do you view your diagnostic investments? Do you see any difference between the stakeholders that you're assembling around to address the access and delivery issues for diagnostic line investments compared to your therapeutic-based? You mentioned pediatric praziquantel. Are there differences between the two that are notable in light of this access kind of question?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. I think when it comes to diagnostics, as you might have noted when I did the presentation, the breakdown of our investments, we do have a few diagnostics coming in through the pipeline, and this is not by choice. This is just probably what's out there. And probably, I think one of the other challenges is that, we already have challenges with therapeutics, which are volume-based, and the volume is there. And probably this volume is even less when it comes to diagnostics. So there's that less of an incentive when it comes to innovators and product developers coming in. So, but at the same time, if we're going into this, we are now in this era of antimicrobial resistance where we need to have more science-based diagnostics for the therapeutics that we're developing. Otherwise, we're just going to develop therapeutics. We give them without proper diagnostics, and then we lose them to resistance. So there is that need to find more incentives to really encourage that pipeline for diagnostics. So I think the issue with diagnostics is not so much the access to them; it's more the research and development for them. But once this pipeline starts really filling up, the access considerations about pricing and usability in the kind of context where they're needed are really the same, and those need to be considered all the same. But for us, really now as GHIT, we're really fighting to get as many more diagnostics into the pipeline. And if we can really pair some of these therapeutics with the diagnostics, like for example, if we can have a diagnostic for schistosomiasis, already schistosomiasis, they're like different species. So if you can have diagnosis that could differentiate the species, or if it could be more specific, could be more accurate, then it could probably, lengthen the lifespan of some of the therapeutics we're developing. So there's that need to move the diagnostics research and development along as well.
That's a fantastic answer. I think based in some real world experience that you've got there in terms of your work in Schisto. So that's a great answer. I think it's a good time to bring some questions in from the audience, which there are quite a few amassing. We've got to shift 2 of the WHO roadmaps. We will leave shift 3 until the end. The country ownership shift, we'll come to that at the end and tie it all together. But the biggest backdrop to all of this year has been COVID. We alluded to that in the previous session, how much of it light has been shone onto the social inequalities, drivers of poverty, diseases of poverty, public health, responsibility that comes with that, all of that through COVID, through that optic. And some of the questions we've had come through. So from the National Institute of Health at in Portugal, from Dr. Maria João Gouveia, do you think that COVID-19, the situation with COVID-19, will improve the interaction of academics and companies in a way to develop novel drugs, alternative treatments for NTDs, or is it that these NTDs don't spread as fast as COVID, so there won't be as much interest? What will COVID do? So I think I'll ask Margo that first from a corporate kind of perspective. And I could ask the panelists to press mute. That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and it's a great question. I'm sure it's also the $1 million question that we're all wondering about, and I am hopeful that I think COVID has unveiled the benefit of sharing IP, of tech transfers, of collaborative processes for R&D, and the sheer acceleration of projects in the pipeline when there are multiple players all contributing. So I think that has demonstrated that there is a significant value in that type of collaboration. And I think collaboration has evolved a bit over the past year. We've seen some really interesting new partnerships that we haven't in the past. We've seen big pharma partnering with competitors in big pharma to develop, and distribute vaccines. So I think it has opened the door to new opportunities and to new ways of thinking. I hope that it will translate into new ways of thinking for NTDs as well, and new partnerships for NTDs. But I do believe that there is now a greater emphasis on if you as a pharmaceutical company are not able to reach a certain population, or whether it's due to supply or whether it's due to your market presence, or you're not willing, it's not part of your market plan, then make sure that you're sharing the IP so someone else will, and another company can step up, and another maybe generic company can fill that gap. And I think that message has been quite clear in COVID, and I think it's a message that we can replicate in the NTD space as well.
That's a fantastic answer, Margo. Thank you for that. And I suppose we can hone that into it, because there's another question from Paul Ho, and I can ask that to Isaac specifically on that line in terms of how's COVID impacted. Margo's mentioned some of the positives there. Paul's asking quite specifically, how's COVID impacted GHIT in terms of funding and progress with projects? Perhaps some of the answer Margo's given there in terms of this de-risking, but how has it impacted GHIT specifically?
I think I'll start with the progress. I think at the beginning of the pandemic last year, almost all our the projects that are in late stages of development in clinical phases, they were stopped, because there were lockdowns all over, particularly in the countries where we're having the clinical trials. So for a few months, maybe 6 months, projects were stopped. As really people, I think at that time, people really had no idea what had hit us. So people were trying to figure out how do we deal with this. So I think the first thing that everybody did was let's lock down, and then really come back slowly once we understand what's happening. And that took a few months more than we had anticipated. But the projects have since reopened, but that has had some financial consequences for sure, because we've had to, I mean, the grant, our partners who are doing the research on the ground have had to re-evaluate the way they conduct the clinical trials. Now they have to put COVID infection control protocols in place. That needed more money. They had maybe to retrain the staff because they'd been laid off for a few months. But one of the things that we've really tried to do at GHIT is because we know this is a global event. So if our grantee comes to us and says, we've had this issue, there's no doubt, because we understand what is happening. So one of the things that really we've been trying to do is to be as nimble as possible and try to be as responsive and supportive as possible, wherever possible, to the product developers, so that we can, if there's any financial supplement that is needed to really cover for those costs, wherever possible, we've really tried to step up. So that's just on the progress, but I think we're sort of back on track. Albeit there will be delays, in the last few phases of the trials. But when it comes to funding itself, I could say so far from what we've been funding, it's been okay. We've managed to really maintain the funding to the best of our capacity, but we like everybody else, we're anticipating some major challenges going forward because of the economic impact of this pandemic. It's still I think studies are continuously being updated, and the pandemic is still ongoing, so we don't really know what the economic impact is going to be at the end, that's something that we are really keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and that's a very fair point. Actually, we're not through this yet, so it's still having its effects to kind of take into consideration. Thank you for that answer. I'd like to ask that question in terms of the COVID effect to Olawale, because obviously the DNDi are very advanced in terms of their access programs for chaga, sleeping sickness. I know you've got an interest in snake bite as well, which we have a session on later. So from the PDP perspective, Olawale, how has COVID changed, not your definitions of access, but your approach to it?
So from a program standpoint, as Isaac said, it slowed things down a bit in 2020. Things were slow, and we have to admit that. And, the focus was on COVID, but things have picked up now, thankfully. Perspective-wise, Margo used a good word, and the word was acceleration. Right? In many ways, I see COVID as an accelerant.
Yeah.
It's really accelerated collaboration with companies, and also companies and global health institutions. It's accelerated the need for the world, right, to see LMICs as a market and not just a place where you give donations, right? Yeah. And it's also just accelerated the need to pay attention to global health, period. And I'm optimistic. I mean, I think this would ultimately be a good thing, to at least initiate dialogues in the future. If as a PDP we were ever to go, we had to go to a company to talk about a random disease that we never heard of, right? I'm hoping that because of their experience with COVID, when they hear Africa, when they hear specific diseases, they wouldn't just shut the door on us. They would actually listen.
Yeah.
Right. And also for the donors, I'm hopeful now that, they would pay attention to just certain diseases. Even if it's just simply from the fact that they're afraid. They're like, if we don't do this, right, who knows, this might become the next COVID, in 2030, we need to pay attention to it. It's an accelerant. So I think it's in a weird way, it's going to be a positive for all of us moving forward.
I think that's a fantastic answer, and we completely share your optimism. It really has focused the minds, COVID, onto public health, the way the poverty within societies is allowing diseases to spread, what needs to be done, and the actual patients themselves, which all plays into this concept of access having far more prominence than it has had before. So we're completely with you on that. And that kind of leads me to the next, the final kind of question, really, and that's the final shift of the WHO roadmap. You mentioned, all of you in your responses, that COVID has really upended the economy. Isaac was saying just waiting to see how it's going to unroll. Well, the last shift in the WHO roadmap really is all about country ownership, right? Moving from an external-led position to a country ownership, sovereign model of ownership of combating these diseases. Part and parcel of that is the political will, government level, to initiate, you said markets earlier, Olawale, but to the legislators kind of legislating to create markets in a traditional sense. But I'm just wondering that with the COVID upending all different types of sectors, reconfiguring the sovereign economy of a country, how much financial capital investment is going to play a part in all of this moving forward? And what I'm really trying to say here is that you've got areas like digital diagnostics or cohesive data sharing platforms or technologies that are definitely going to impact on access. And I'm just wondering how, and I suppose I'm going to ask you this first, Margo. You should have to forgive me, but I always do that, but to get that kind of that feel to it. How do you think, as the economies realign, as they stabilize out of COVID, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on new kind of areas? I've mentioned digital, the digital kind of world and its impact. How do you think that's going to play out in terms of access and redefining access? Margo.
Yeah, it's a complex question to unpack, but I think at the essence is definitely the idea of universal healthcare, in that as we hopefully move out of this pandemic, there will be an increased realization from individual country governments, as well as multilateral organizations and sort of the top global health funding governments in high-income countries that typically do contribute the most. I think there will be a realization, and it's already starting for sure in some governments, but that ultimately at the crux of the matter is universal healthcare and strong health systems that can, bounce back and that can weather a storm like COVID, and ultimately still provide the treatments and vaccines and diagnostics for all of the other disease areas that haven't gone away and aren't going away anytime soon. And NTDs being one of those that still deserves the necessary attention. So I think it's just moving towards a space where we can all recognize the importance of that and what it means for each individual disease area being able, to have the attention that it deserves within a healthcare system.
Brilliant. I suppose a lot of this, thanks for the answer, Margo, comes down to the correct policy triggers, having those kind of triggers to hand. So I'd like to ask Mathias, who I left out of the last round of questions, so we're going to go straight to you. Given that leprosy, your leprosy advocacy has at some level changed policy in a country the size of India, where you had employment law was changed by the advocacy of the leprosy missions, that you need to involve patients who have been stigmatized, thrown out of their communities with leprosy, bring them back into the workplace. You have clear impact at the policy level. What would be your message to countries realigning their economies post-COVID, given the WHO roadmap shift? We're trying to get country ownership. Part of that is political, part of that is the investment capital. What's your message, Mathias, in terms of the role the communities can play in that realignment of the economies?
Well, I think the role of the community is very important. In India specifically, but also in other countries, we still have, sadly, discriminatory laws in place. We know that for sure for leprosy, there might be some for other NTDs that are, well, the most elegant term I could find for it was probably archaic. But they are still in place. Sometimes they're not enforced, but still that remains as an important obstacle. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, I think we need some positive laws, some laws that really make sure that people can live a life in dignity. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen and what gives me a lot of hope is when well, you always have authorities and governments that that are proactive and take the first step, and they really take ownership. Yeah, and we've seen that, and we applaud that. Sometimes, though, it's the people, it's the communities, it's the people that force the authorities to take ownership, that hold them accountable. And anyways, even the best people in government, they will overlook things. They are not able to look at everything at the same time. So it's the people that have to claim their rights, and it's the people that have to hold them accountable, and it's the people that will, and we've seen that do that.
We've got 5 minutes left for this session then, so I thought I'll ask that question to Isaac and to Olawale. In terms of this, I suppose my question, I'll reframe the question. What do countries need? What would you like to see happen? I mean, we mentioned all these law changes. When it comes to things like diagnostics, the thing that's holding back those markets from developing is regulatory harmonization for those development pathways. How far into that do you anticipate GHIT and DNDi getting involved with, in terms of these stakeholders that these strategic alliances that you build? How far along the influencing regulatory harmonization road do you think GHIT or DNDi would go down?
Okay, I'll take a step first, Ole. So I think probably for GHIT we'll continue engaging through the global platform that I spoke to about earlier. But really the thing is the political will has to be there. I mean, neglected tropical diseases are neglected, and there's that risk that they will be neglected even more post-COVID. But I think what we need to push for now is for countries to have the capacity to tackle or to follow all the diseases, all the health challenges, be they neglected diseases, infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, but still have the resilience, to deal with emergencies when they come. So I think this is really where the emphasis should be on the country, or on the country ownership and the political will. But I also just wanted to tag on to what Mathias said about country ownership. I think when we talk of country ownership, the first thing that comes to mind is the government. But it's actually not that. It really goes down to the grassroots, to the people, to the patients, to the communities themselves. And if they really push, what's happening in HIV now came from activism from the ground. TB is the same thing. So we need that same push in the NTD community as well. Let's hold our politicians are accountable, our councillors, our MPs, and then they push for those policies to be in place.
So the revolution shall not be live; it shall be. So, any final words, Olawale, on this revolution?
I would also echo Isaac's comments. For the DNDi, we're happy to see the momentum that is happening, and the fact that African governments are taking ownership, and you see this with all the new amazing things that have happened, like the African Medicine Supply Platform. This is something that we've been talking about for a very long time, but it's happening now because of COVID. You have countries that are fast tracking the review of new evidence and so on because of COVID. There's a big mobilization of the private sector. You go to places like Nigeria, the COVID response is single-handedly being funded by the private sector. And as you said, Isaac, COVID is also opening people's eyes, the communities, showing them that they have a voice and they can hold, their politicians and policymakers accountable and so on. So we want to plug into all this movement as an organization, and we're very happy to see it happen. The last thing I would just say is that I do also think governments need to continue to be supported. They need, I don't use the word help because help is not the word, but facilitation.
Yeah.
To think about how to prioritize, investments. You have tons of entities out there, so how do they prioritize? How do they budget? How do they think about investment cases and so on? That technical support, I think, is still very important. So we shouldn't just leave governments now to their own, what's the word? Vices of accord and so on. So yeah.
I think that's a very optimistic and fantastic end to that session. What's very, very clear is that these are neglected. We talk about neglected tropical diseases. At the heart of this is neglected people, communities that have just been left disenfranchised. They're not part of their country kind of overview from their perspectives. And I think the irony is not lost, that it's going to come back down to that voice being expressed that's going to have any real lasting sustainable change, whether that's through the first session, the financial incentivization, reimagining that, or whether it's through the giving more weight, more gravitas to access with these different pulls, such as the UHC as an example, this realignment after post-COVID. These are very positive pulls, all of them taking the voice of the people and translating it into access, meaningful, impactful access. I can only say thank you very, very much to all the panelists. It's been a bit of a marathon for a few of you, for Margo and for Olawale. So I think a cup of tea is probably in order right now. A massive round of applause. People are saying excellent presentations. Thank you to all of you in the chats that are all coming through. So thank you very, very much. I'm wishing you all a good day. Come on, the revolution. Yeah. Yeah. Take care, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.